So just quickly, these lessons we do are not to promote excitement and entertainment and to produce eye-catching thumbnails and charismatic titles to garner views. These are lessons that we that take the Bible seriously as a way of life, to go over what it speaks to humanity today in its context, as plain as it is written historically. So, with that said, I assume the lesson prior to this one has been heard, so this one makes sense. So you have an understanding. So moving along here, let's conclude the 3rd chapter of the book of Amos. Amos chapter 3, verses 13 through 15. Hear and testify against the house of Jacob, declares the Lord, the God of hosts. For on the day that I punish Israel's transgressions, I will also punish the altars of Bethel. The horns of the altar will be cut off, and they will fall to the ground. I will also smite the winter house, together with the summer house. The houses of ivory will also perish, and the great houses will come to an end, declares the Lord. So the northern kingdom is in the crosshairs of God's judgment for the way they were, their beings, their character and livelihood, their existence. Well, it was contrary to being in covenant with God. So the words penned by the prophet Amos, per God's requests, verse 13, hear and testify against the house of Jacob, declares the Lord. So the house of Jacob refers just to whom we are talking about here in the 3rd chapter of Amos. The house of Jacob refers to the northern kingdom, the 9 tribes to the north, which did not include the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Now, the tribe of Levi had its beginnings with the northern kingdom's 10 tribes. But the tribe of Levi sojourned to the southern kingdom because Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, took leadership over the 10 tribes and took them up north and set up a religion with altars. In the north, there was Dan, and in the south, Bethel. So the altars that Jeroboam set up and they were golden calves. He set up 2 golden calves. They were set up in the north of Israel and the south of Judah. So whichever way one was traveling could conveniently visit upon one of those golden calves, one of those altars. And so Jeroboam monopolized, so to speak, the travel route with those altars of golden calves because he desired the people to not return to the temple in Jerusalem in the southern kingdom. It was a religious thing to stabilize his kingdom. So God is targeting the house of Jacob, Israel, which is another name for the northern kingdom. Now Isaiah 10 is all of and about the devastation and destruction that God is going to use the Assyrian army to judge the northern kingdom. And after the Assyrians have completed their campaign of destruction, God will unload on the Assyrians. But there will be a remnant left over. So let's read here in Isaiah chapter 10, verses 20 through 22. Now it will come about in that day that the remnant of Israel and those of the house of Jacob who have escaped will never again rely on the one who struck them, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For through your people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea. Only a remnant within them will return. A destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness. So even though God devastated the house of Jacob, he did not entirely destroy them. No, sir. For there was a remnant, a chosen people that would overcome. They would be overcomers. And it's fascinating here that the Apostle Paul, as he is preaching to the Romans, well, he used this fulfilled prophecy in his ministry to the Romans. In Romans chapter 9, verses 27 through 29, Paul says, and quotes Amos in his own words, "And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. For the Lord will execute his word upon the earth thoroughly and quickly. And just as Isaiah foretold, except the Lord of the Sabbath had left to us a posterity, we would have become as Sodom and would have resembled Gomorrah." So Paul gleans the collective truth of the remnant. He preached this fulfilled prophecy to the Romans, that these are the present day elect of God out of Israel that were left out of that era. Saying that here in the first century. So that's the house of Jacob. The house of Jacob was to return to Israel. Let's jump way ahead here to Amos chapter 9, verses 8 through 15. Let's just get a hold on this. "Behold, the eyes of the Lord God are on the sinful kingdom," the northern kingdom, "and I will destroy it from the face of the earth. Nevertheless, I will not destroy the house of Jacob, declares the Lord. Behold, I am commanding, I will shake the house of Jacob." And that's just another way of saying the house of Israel. "I will shake the house of Jacob among all nations, as grain is shaken in a sieve, but not a kernel will fall to the ground. All the sinners of my people will die by the sword." So the kernel not falling to the ground, they are the remnant people that God will hold on to, that will give birth to other peoples after that, and so on. "But all the sinners of my people," those who are going to die at the arsenal of the Assyrians. "But all the sinners of my people will die by the sword. Those who say the calamity will not overtake or confront us." Isn't that always the mind of man? Like nationalism or imperialism, that kind of thing. "Nobody can overthrow the United States, blah, 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 blah. I'm tough." Well, it just takes one. It just takes one little virus. "In that day I will raise up the fallen booth of David and wall up its breaches. I will also raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who were called by my name, declares the Lord who does this. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman will overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes, him who sows seed, when the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and all the hills will be dissolved. That's Hebraic poetry talking about the fruit of the gospel going forth. Verse 14. "Also, I will restore the captivity of my people Israel, and they will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will also plant vineyards and drink their wine, and make gardens and eat their fruit. I will also plant them on their land, and they will not again be rooted out from their land which I had given them." So that hasn't happened yet. At the time of Amos's writing, it's all part of the Abrahamic covenant that, as the Bible goes on, is eventually fulfilled, but at this point in Amos, it just hasn't happened yet. They have to take up a settlement there and be in a regenerate state. And at this point, it just hadn't happened yet in Amos. So back to the lesson. Verse 13 of chapter 3. Hear and testify against the house of Jacob. So even though God is going to discipline and judge them significantly, well, he's got plans for them. Plans for the remnant. My covenant with Abraham. He's saying it's not going to be overthrown by the sins of these people, see? So there is a form of worship that is to be addressed in this next verse here. In verse 14. For on that day I punish Israel's transgressions. I will also punish the altars of Bethel. The horns of the altar will be cut off, and they will fall to the ground. See, earlier in the lesson we made reference to the fact that Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, set up those calves, those golden calves, those altars, one in Dan and one in Bethel. And those horns represent power. They represent authority, the power of that religion. But when God does it, as in the brazen altar, for instance, when God does it in the court of the priests in the temple, where they would burn the sacrifices, there were horns on all four corners. And just before they would go into the Holy of Holies, there would be the altar of incense inside the holy place. And there were horns on all four corners of the altar of incense. And that represented God's prayer and intercession for God's people and the people seeking God. So God's saying he's going to cut the authority and the power off this altar in Bethel. And we talked a little bit last lesson about King Josiah. God set him apart. And prior to King Josiah's coming into power, the religions between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom was really blinding and distorting the people. These false religions had really taken a hold on them. So God had already spoken on this. Most of the prophets had come and gone. This stuff was written down. Well, as they were going through refurbishing the temple, a priest found a copy of the law. We went over a little bit of this last lesson. The things had degraded to such a low place by that time, or the law wasn't on the hearts of the younger generation. Well, they find this scroll, and this scroll of the law, they brought it to King Josiah, and as they read it to Josiah, he begins to tremble and shake, and he tears his robe. That Hebraic act of remorse. And Josiah essentially says, boy, we're in a lot of trouble here, because the law was read. We're in big time trouble with God. That's what he thought when he heard that law read. The law was read, and they were not living accordingly. The law that was read was to be the consequences and the curses for not doing these things, see? And that instituted, then, a mode of repentance. There was an authentic revival in Israel. It was brief, but there was a revival. So guess what happened to the horns on the altars at Bethel? We go here to 2 Kings, chapter 23, verses 15 through 18. Furthermore, the altar that was at Bethel in the high place, which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, had made, even that altar and the high place he broke down. Then he demolished its stones, ground them to dust, and burned the Asherah. Now when Josiah turned, he saw the graves that were there on the mountain. And he sent and took the bones from the graves, and burned them on the altar, and defiled it, according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these things. Then he said, What is this monument that I see? And the men of the city told him, It is the grave of the man of God, who came from Judah, and proclaimed these things, which you have done against the altar of Bethel. And he said, Let him alone. Let no one disturb his bones. So they left his bones undisturbed, with the bones of the prophet who came from Samaria. Now listen to this verse 19 here. It ties into our last verse in chapter 3 of Amos. And Josiah also removed all the houses of the high places, which were in the cities of Samaria, which the kings of Israel had made, provoking the Lord. And he did to them just as he had done in Bethel. So God brought this to pass. This cutting the power, cutting the authority off, these horns off on the altars of Bethel. That type of religion would be no more. Let's do the last verse of Amos chapter 3, verse 15. I will smite the winter house together with the summer house. The houses of ivory will also perish, and the great houses will come to an end. See, people live high on the hog and reject the one true God. It all comes tumbling down. It does. It's not reality, these material items, these statements of wealth and carnal activity. Sounds like the U.S., don't it? Chapter 4 of Amos. Till next time.